For how could he describe what so weighed him down? How could he explain how long ago he had given up the idea of thought? The point at which he first understood the way things were and knew that any sense we had of existence was merely a reminder of the incomprehensible futility of existence. A futility that would repeat itself ad infinitum, to the end of time, and that, no, it wasn't a matter of chance, and its extraordinary, inexhaustible, triumphant, unconquerable power working to bring matters to birth or annihilation, but rather the matter of a shadowy, demonic purpose, something embedded deep in the heart of things, in the texture of the relationship between things, the stench of whose purpose filled every atom. That it was a curse, a form of damnation. That the world was the product of scorn, and God helped the sanity of those who called themselves thinkers, which was why he longer thought, had learned not to think any more. Not that this led anywhere, of course, because wherever he looked, whichever way he turned, there was that all-pervasive stench, the stench that was there because the last word, the word that comprehended the knowledge that futility and scorn, replete with purpose, was coextensive with the world, was the world, was something of which he had to be conscious, an eternity of futility and scorn that obtained in each and every second of life for those who had set out as thinkers. Futility because as soon as you abandoned thought and tried simply to look at things, thought cropped up again in a new form, a form from which, in other words, there was no escape whatever man thought or did not think, because he remained the prisoner of thought either way, and his nose was deeply pained by the stench of it. So what could he do except console himself with the thought that events simply followed their own natural course?
Hi, this is Stephanie.
This is David.
And this is Nick, and welcome to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast, where today we're talking about The Last Wolf by László Krasznahorkai, which is basically a very classic Krasznahorkai. It's a story of an older German writer sitting in an empty bar telling a story to basically a sleeping, somewhat bored Hungarian barman that essentially encompasses all of the wonderful things we've come to expect from the author that come down to basically examining things to their very small minutia and trying to understand the relations between, the natural world and basically the futility of it all, which we heard from that nice quote read by David at the beginning. So speaking of the natural world, Steph, can you let us know why us talking about it this weekend actually has some nice synergy there?
Oh, yes, some definite synergy here in the United States anyway, where we'll actually get to see it. But we will be, actually this same weekend, you'll be able to see what's called a super blood wolf moon, which is the most
awesome name for a moon ever.
Yeah. Favorite black metal record as well.
Yeah, how that all came together, which is pretty great because each one of those words actually means something different. Like super, their moon will be closest to Earth in its orbit. Blood, it's going to have a reddish tint. And then I think wolf means that it occurs in January, which, those three things coming together. What are the odds?
So we perfectly planned that, naturally. So on that note of that synergy and the super blood wolfness of this all, David, the first thing to talk about with this story is that it is in fact one sentence. It's about 75 pages long, and it just flows from start to finish without that single period. So what's kind of your read on how well this works and how he pulls it off?
So I've read a few things from him. I read a book of his shorter stories, a little novella he published inside the music and literature publication. And then I've read one of his novels, and I'd say I think I can get into the shorter stuff better because it requires you to really get through it and spend as much time with it in one sitting as possible.
Yeah.
But when you do that, I think it's pretty rewarding. It is a unique reading experience that we don't usually get. And it certainly fits the narrator that appears, especially in The Last Wolf. I think it fits the character very well and tends to fit most of the characters in which the narrative is sort of filtered through.
Yeah, it definitely sort of fits his classic character, and I guess we can get into that, but Steph, how did you deal with the flow? Were you a fan or not a fan?
I was a fan, and yeah, kind of like David said, once you got into the short story, The Last Wolf, it became like your little world, because it is one sentence. So you definitely had to get in the same mindset as the author. And I actually read through the short story twice, once on a train and then once at home, in more of a silent environment. And I would say that doing that, I was able to become more engrossed in the novel than I was sitting on a train surrounded by noisy people. So maybe take that into mind when you're attempting to read anything by this author.
Yeah, it definitely commands your entire attention. And I found that, if you start to break it up, you lose some of that flow. So it's kind of, I like it because of that aspect that, it's always kind of a question with Krasznahorkai whether or not he picks that structure and then writes his characters and his style around that, or rather he starts writing his characters and his stories and then has no choice but to put it into that flow. And I'm not sure if it's specifically one versus the other, but he doesn't have, at least to my knowledge, most of his other works do sort of follow this style, but it's not as 100% expansive. Definitely has, multi-page sentences in other works, but he hasn't really run for the entire shoot the moon kind of thing. So I like it because it's at the same time sort of maximalist in that way, but then he also did it in the confines of a very short story, which sort of gives it a little bit of a constrained writing appeal to it, is what can I really pull off with that single sentence?
Yeah. And do you guys think he's going for a stream of consciousness when he's doing the single sentence thing? Is that his goal, to let you really get inside the narrator's head? Or is it something different?
I don't think it is so much here because we are sort of playing with time, because he's in the bar telling the story over a period of, I think, 2 days.
Yeah, because he leaves to go to the telecafe next door.
Yeah, he does a walk around the block.
To send some emails from his sbcglobal.net email account.
Yeah. So there's the tale he tells before he leaves to go to, Extremadura?
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
And then there's the tale that he comes back and tells again to the same Hungarian bartender who is, let's say, the bartender is like a stand-in for a reader of Krasznahorkai in a certain way, that if you're not going in full bore with what he's doing, then you're kind of going to space out a bit. Maybe like Steph on the train, or like me when I tried to read it during my lunch break at work, and I was like, I can't do this right now.
Yeah, that's interesting, yeah.
Yeah, this novel feels like the quintessential essence of what he does, and that quote at the beginning almost, to me, feels like a little bit of a wink at him sort of acknowledging his own thought process and maybe his own writing style, because there are times, even though I enjoyed it, you certainly do feel a prisoner to the narrative. There's no break.
Yeah, there's a lot of winks, by the way, as to his own thing, kind of buried in this, and I'll read one of them. But he said, who had written a few unreadable books full of ponderously negative sentences and depressing logic in claustrophobic prose, a series of books, in fact, when it had long become obvious, almost immediately obvious, that no one read them, of course, and that being the case, he must long have been washed up as a philosopher. So I like it because this is the first thing that I can think of that he's written that he's actually sort of poking fun at sort of this most obvious structural aspect of it, of like, who the hell is actually reading this in the first place?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But like, back to the question of, is it stream of consciousness or not? I actually enjoy this a lot because to me it has the sort of literary equivalent of the single shot film, because the stream of consciousness aspect to me isn't really present in this because it is just truly a story, right? It's a story that somebody's telling start to finish, and it goes in and out of the actual content of the story, them sort of looking for the quote unquote last wolf. But it's actually within the confines of just this bar, maybe him walking a little bit on the German streets. But everything is vocal. It's actually something that is being told in real time. And then as he dives into the story of being out on sort of, I guess, the plains in Spain, and then coming back to having the barman show up and interrupt him as to, what are the details of the story. It's really playing with what the setting is, but it's actually sort of quite linear in that it all happens just as this real-time flow.
And the barbs at himself that you were talking about, Nick, the quote that you just read. So when I read The Last Wolf, that was actually the first thing that I had ever read by, I'm just going to call him Kratz because the name.
That works.
Yeah,
there we
thank
go.
you.
We can do whatever we want. It's Super Blood Wolf Moon Week.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a free-for-all. It's chaos. Yeah. So that was actually the first thing that I had read by this author. And to be honest, the first time I read it, I didn't fully enjoy it. And I don't think I got a lot of things because, like Nick said, he was kind of making fun of himself a lot. But unless you had read some of his earlier works, I think you wouldn't pick up on a lot of those things. I kind of just, for me, the first time I read it, I was like, oh, what is this, older author, self-lament and apathy and I don't know. I just didn't understand where he was coming from. But in this edition of the book that we read from New Directions, it also has another short story in there called Herman, which I actually highly recommend you maybe read first because that was actually written 25 years prior to The Last Wolf.
They're kind of the same topic. Actually.
They are. But you can tell that it was written when he was younger. It's much more straightforward, more in your face, I thought, and a little more gory than The Last Wolf. But
yeah, he definitely has kind of expanded more as he's kind of progressed as a writer and tried to encompass sort of what it means to really look at things in such specific detail.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, so I got similar vibes to reading this as Austerlitz by Sebald. And it does a lot of the same things where it's basically this story that is oftentimes sort of capturing another story. So it's a story about a story. So you get a lot of these sort of sequential, like he said that he said kind of lines. And it's almost a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek way of playing of how stories exist. But then I think there's kind of this fundamental difference where a lot of Sebald stuff is about taking all, like basically these macro level ideas and sort of boiling down into this small thing, where this story is really looking at this tiny idea and boiling it up, if you can boil in that direction, into this very big thing, right? Mm-hmm. It's finding this relationship, and we can get into that with the warden and the wolves. But it's kind of looking at actually what I think are kind of big questions, like actually how do you identify with nature? What are real relationships? What does it look like to be isolated and misunderstood and stuff like that? And all of this comes out of this sort of somewhat bonkers tale of an old German author being sort of weirdly,
whisked away to Spain.
Yeah, invited off into the plains and not really knowing what to do with it. So suddenly fixating on this idea of the last wolf purely because they used the word perished a bunch of times.
I was going to say, and that was really interesting how he even came across, his journey to find the last wolf, because he thought the journalist was too poetic in the way he described.
Yeah, they don't use words like that in science.
The perishing of the wolves. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think one key difference between like the Sebald style and at least especially The Last Wolf is there's a lot of distance from the reader and what I think is kind of the story he's trying to tell. And we get that through the frame. We get that through him not understanding Spanish, and there's this translator and he doesn't really know what the full story is. There's a lot of like removing you from any sort of empathy that's not centered on the narrator himself. Like there's too much distance to the story he's trying to tell, if indeed that's the story he's trying to tell, because I think there's an idea that he's actually, solipsistic, and maybe his story is more about how he had to deal with all these problems, not necessarily the last wolf itself and whatever emotional feeling you might get about that natural extinction, or, unnatural extinction, rather.
That's a really good point, because at the apex of his story,
he stops.
He stops and he says, he goes to the bartender. He's like, "Hey, what? Are you asleep?" Yeah. And you're just like, "This is the finale. This should be where you're the most enthralled." And,
yeah.
And yet the guy had fallen asleep.
Yeah. There's also in the apex of the story within the story when Julio's basically, he starts rapidly speaking in Spanish, and the interpreter, it's so emotional for her that she can't.
Jose. Yeah. Was his name Jose or?
Is it Jose? Did I say Julio? It's
I think
Jose.
So, yeah.
Have I said Julio more than once? I hope not.
I don't know.
Okay. Well, we'll just go with actually the correct one, Jose. So as Jose's speaking quickly, and the interpreter sort of is caught up in the emotion of it all, He being the German author goes on to say, because he couldn't understand why he was being left to his own devices at the most exciting moment of the story, for the narrative having been broken in this way, it seemed that there was no need for him in the Jeep, that he was redundant, because his heart was not broken the way the interpreter's clearly was. And all this made him utterly furious with her, though he still didn't know why, couldn't know why, because he didn't think of himself as somebody who could look on another human being in tears without feeling part of the grief. So he's essentially kind of exactly what you said, David. He's feeling wronged because he's not included in it, because he's not part of the empathy itself, thus is kind of lacking the empathy.
Yeah. And just at the very end, when Jose's about to confess something to him, he just goes, don't worry, I know what you're going to say. But then later forgets what it was and just kind of imagines what it will be. So like when the book ends, it's our narrator is imagining the ending to what Jose was going to tell him or going to confess to him.
I thought Jose just gave him a hug. Or it wasn't a hug exactly, but it was I can't remember the exact wording,
at the very
phrase
end,
of it.
It's like so they go outside the Jeep together. He says he would try to do so in English, faintly smiling as he said. And so they went over to the Jeep where Jose Miguel cleared his throat, looked straight in his eyes, and told him in broken English that he had something he had wanted to confess. And then it breaks, and he goes to the bartender, hey, wake up. And then he returns to a story. Well, it was precisely what I expected, he said. So I told him not to tell me. We simply embraced, and that was how I left him. And then in the very end, I think at the very last page, it goes on. Day after day, he had been rewriting the end to Jose Miguel's story in his head, and that's exactly where he was now at the end.
I see. So he didn't end up telling him. I thought what he wanted to tell him was that he wanted to give him a hug.
No, I imagine
I
wanted
think
to
right.
confess that he
it.
was...
Yeah.
My imagination was that he killed the last wolf.
Right.
But,
so I have a different interpretation of both of yours. Is that...
or it was all a lie.
I thought it was basically implying that it was obvious that he killed the last wolf, and that the German author knew and thus didn't make him say it out loud. And I got a little emotional because I felt that it was two basically isolated, misunderstood people finding a little bit of a bond. Mm-hmm. And then as the outro of the story goes, as he's writing and rewriting it, he's finding that he still doesn't know how to communicate something that authentic, because it is sort of, the futility of it all. Like it isn't relevant to other people. So I actually thought it was him having an emotional connection, not the void of it.
Yeah, I'm sitting over here pondering that. I think I missed that. I thought what he was trying to keep a secret was the fact that he was helping the wolves, which I think you could pretty much figure that out pretty easily. Yeah.
But it's it's a question of... Did
he accidentally kill the last wolf, or did he purposefully kill the last wolf?
Well, I don't think he didn't kill the last wolf. It was another guy, right?
Oh, right, yeah, okay.
But he had been the one that was loosening the traps and stuff. And
right.
And thus, when the last mom wolf got killed, he was so emotional. But there was still one more that they thought had maybe gone to Portugal or something like that. But ended up being still in the same territory, and then somebody had killed it.
See, I imagine that he was the one that killed it, and that's why he was so emotional.
That's okay. That's what I thought you were saying, Nick. That Jose, the warden, had actually killed the last wolf.
Oh,
yeah.
That's pretty heavy.
I thought he was just he was the one saying, interesting, like put it out of its misery style. See, I thought he was just wanting to confess of being the one because he was so conflicted of being the warden. It says earlier in the book that men and wolves are natural enemies. Who could be so stupid as to be loosening these traps and such?
Yeah.
So that I thought that he was simply confessing over basically being a fraud in his own sort of position as being the warden.
What his job actually is.
But the extra level of him killing the last wolf itself, I don't know. I'll dig into this as you guys.
I didn't catch that though. Yeah.
I mean, maybe that was just my imagination running with things, but it seemed so weird. What would he have to confess? Because the confession of wanting to save the wolves doesn't seem like a confession. That seems like an honorable thing based on the amount of emotion in the car and things that have been going on. And especially considering he didn't want to say whatever he was about to say in front of the interpreter. So to me it seemed, I don't know.
But it says right here, it says, but then one day in 1993, they discovered it had not gone anywhere, that there was no Portugal waiting for it, because one early dawn, a shepherd, a certain Alexandro, rang him to come at once because he had shot a wolf by a pond.
Oh.
So I thought it was, unless there's a name thing going on, I think it's a different person. And I mean, I guess the reason why it makes sense to me is in a lot of Krasznahorkai stories, there's sort of this like simple, very pure individual that gets caught up in the idea or circumstance of a thing and is sort of like independent and disconnected from the rest of the world. And it's kind of beautiful in a way because they have such authentic emotions, but a lot of the things they get so caught up in are so tiny and irrelevant that you can just feel that the entirety of the world around them doesn't care, but they're so obsessive about it that they just get wrapped up. So I guess that's sort of like the context of why I thought that this guy and his tiny burden that he was carrying was actually so much bigger when he was telling the story, and actually managed to identify with the German author, because as the book, or as the story says earlier, keeps getting wrapped up in a labyrinth of thoughts and undecipherable prose and things that other people can't really connect with either. So they're both kind of held captive by their own sort of pure isolation in their little minutiae.
As much as I love that, narratively, I don't know how Jose would know that about the German that doesn't speak Spanish in the back of his car that he met for the day.
I'm not sure that Jose needs to know it. It's more like he gets wrapped up in his own thing, and then the German author sees that quality in him, and then that is their brief kinship.
And so his inability at the end of the story is an inability to tell something simply and honestly, and he can't do that.
Yeah, like how could you possibly recapture how authentic the story and its emotional impact was to the warden with simply using words? And it's almost like the only way that the story can exist itself is by being the 100% like real-time narrative of it all. Because if you were trying to summarize anything, if you're trying to rewrite it or create, fiction out of it, like you would lose its fundamental essence. Thus, the only way the story can exist is by just a direct telling of the story.
But he didn't give us direct telling.
No, he's narrating the entire time to a Hungarian dude behind the bar.
Quite terribly, I think.
Yeah.
But that's the whole like beauty of it. I mean, I think that's in a weird way. I think like you have this awesome blend, Krasznahorkai, in kind of an experimental approach, but to me, it's actually sort of this like bonkers version of realism, because he just focuses literally on the real time thoughts and speech and how quickly we get wrapped up into little eddy currents of things cycling in our brain that pitch us off in a certain direction. And he just has a character that just talks like that or thinks like that and isn't afraid to like follow these relationships and angles and directions. And to me, isn't that realism? I mean, that's what's in my fucking brain all the time. It's terrible. Like, we don't think about things linearly. We are a mess upstairs.
All the different paths you could take.
I mean, I'm just speaking for myself here. Maybe you guys are organized, and that's why nobody else is feeling this right now. I get it.
I mean, all my thoughts are perfectly linear. I don't know what you're crazy.
I have no problems.
Yeah. And I think for me, like the story of Herman is where, to me, it even went like one step further with that, because he acted on a lot of these crazy things. Like instead of Jose and then the narrator of The Last Wolf, kind of both, like you were saying, Nick, both kind of feeling isolated in their own way. But to me, they were almost resigned to that isolation, much as I think the older author, or because the author's older, he's also resigned to, I don't know, maybe he's jaded. I don't know the right word for that. Whereas I felt like in Herman, the main character acted out and tried to, like, he wanted to know what was wrong and why did he feel this way. And he went to the doctor several times thinking something was wrong with them. And then he actually fought back against these things that were making him feel that way. And I don't know. I think that's why I maybe enjoyed Herman more, because I felt like it was, let's do something about it versus just being resigned to our fate of futility and scorn.
The Stammgast is just resigned himself to one beer every few hours
to nurse it.
Yeah. I did want to say one thing I thought, because there were some funny bits in The Last Wolf, like the bartender, how like when he actually mentioned this twice, I think almost the exact same sentence. He was like, well, I guess this German guy is okay. You know, he's really not even a proper Eastern European or a decent looking chick, but you know, he keeps all the hoodlums out of my bar because of his size. So
That's right.
I was just like, why was that even necessary? Just, I don't know, to give a farcical lighter side to this pretty heavy story that the narrator's trying to tell. I don't know.
Yeah, there's definitely sort of this awesome comedic bleakness that exists in a lot of his works that I really enjoy. And I haven't read a ton of other Hungarian stuff, but I do sort of associate that a little bit with some of the Eastern European literature. Is just that, you know, I think the landscape and weather and certain political climates are certainly a factor in it. But there's a humor to it where they seem very okay with being a little bit dark, but also catching the tiny little glimmers of humor as they pepper in there.
Yeah, especially in that frame narrative, that world that he's in, whatever German university town that he's in is so bizarre. The way he describes it, his focus on people spitting on the ground so it's sticky wherever you walk, so you can't stand in one place for too long. the odd use of Turkish pop music in the bar that somehow also keeps people from entering for too long of a time. It was just very surreal feeling, I thought.
Yeah, I think there's nothing more surreal than really dirty German sidewalks, because that entire place is just like spick and span.
These are lies.
It's the cleanest country of all time. So I guess on that note, you know, to kind of wrap this up in the classic way, you know, do we think that this kind of later Krasznahorkai, it's I think from 2008 or 2009, but do we think that this is a thing of substance? Steph?
Oh, I have to go first?
You're teed up.
No, I think I've expressed my sentiments previously somewhat, and I did enjoy the short story, or the one sentence. I enjoyed it much more after I read other works by this author. So I definitely recommend. I went ahead and read Herman, but then also, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing this correctly, but I want to say it this way because it sounds awesome, Satan Tango. And after reading those and then rereading The Last Wolf, I actually understood the author a lot more, and I appreciated what he was doing with that short story. So that would be my recommendation to all the people out there.
Yeah, I second that. I think this is not, even though it's short, it's not the place to start. I think you can start with, I really enjoyed his collection, The World Goes On. It's a collection of short stories that are really great. I think that's a decent place to start if you can't handle a novel of this kind of thinking and stream of consciousness, or what did you refer to it as? Ultra realism or something, Nick? I can't. Bonkers realism. Yeah. Bonkers realism.
I like that.
Yeah.
Trademark.
But nonetheless, I think it's great. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and I'll add, I mean, this is probably my favorite, like, still writing contemporary author. And so this is kind of an easy one for me, because there's just like a natural rhythm to it, and the way he just like follows thoughts off into the distance is just, like I kind of said earlier in the podcast, it's just what I feel going on in my head a lot of the time. And so I'm always skeptical, like, you know, the exact antithesis of this is like, you know, reading Hemingway and stuff, when it's so cleanly written and it's so like simply poetic and stuff. I'm just like, man, my brain doesn't work like that. It doesn't have these thoughts.
Yeah, Krasznahorkai is your spirit animal.
Yeah, exactly. So just, I don't know, and that's just filtered through my own sort of, you know, fiction of it all. But like, this thing just works for me. And after, you know, reading most of his other novels, and I know he's got one actually coming out this year as well.
Yeah, looks good.
Just, yeah, exactly. Just.
Is it about wolves?
It's probably about thinking too hard about stuff.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
into it.
Yeah.
He referred to it as his one book.
Yeah, he's got kind of a group of, so it goes from, as you said, Satan Tango into Melancholy Resistance, and then War and War. So I think his latest one is kind of his bookend onto that big idea that he's been tracing together. And they're not, I mean, they have different characters, they have different topics, but the theme all fits. And, you know, tying back to that quote at the beginning, it all is essentially the futility of it all. Because what other hilarious topic is there to write about?
Scorn.
Scorn? Oh, I forgot Scorn.
Scorn is the funnier of the two, I think.
If you had to rank them.
Yeah.
And on that note, we're good.
Super Blood Wolf Moon.